Each of our presenters tonight, Alex Wolf from Scenic Hudson and Cassie Ferrante from Colgate's Upstate Institute, will speak for about 12 to 15 minutes. And then following that, we will offer an opportunity for some questions and answers. We are going to reserve that Q&A for after both of the speakers have had their opportunity to present their work. If, however, you're worried that you'll forget your question, by all means, please submit questions throughout during the chat, and we'll start with those first when we get to the Q&A. A little bit of background about this speaker series. Tonight's session, as I mentioned, is the second in the series of 4 planned events hosted by the Cazenovia Preservation Foundation, Cazenovia Area Community Development Association, better known to most of you as CACTA, United Climate Action Network, and the Cazenovia Chamber of Commerce. As many of you are aware, the Cazenovia Preservation Foundation's mission is to protect the historic agricultural and natural resources in and around Cazenovia for the benefit of the community. And as such, we've had a long history of involvement in landscape and comprehensive planning in Cazenovia. Over the summer, we saw growing interest and activity with regard to commercial solar development in our area. Began to have conversations both within our organization and with others in the community, and recognize that even within groups of like-minded individuals, there's a broad range of opinions about renewable energy generation, both with regard to wind and solar for our area. And we reached out to our partner organizations and discussed the topic a little further and identified some common knowledge gaps that we wanted to try to address. So as a result, that group of 4 organizations worked to organize this panel discussion series to provide some opportunities for education and community forum around this very important issue. In the first session, which was held in late June, the goal was to provide a broad framework and build a common base of knowledge generally within our local community about solar energy generation and commercial solar projects, so that we could continue to engage in some meaningful discussion about how we want to see renewable energy generation implemented in our area. If you missed that session, there are excerpts available that you can find the links to that on the main Beyond Rooftop Solar page on the CPF website. During that session, we heard from some of our presenters about the importance of appropriate siting for solar. And that's what we want to dig into a little bit more tonight. So tonight you'll hear from 2 presenters about the tools that they've developed to help consider some of the complexities around solar siting from a geospatial perspective. And we hope that you'll enjoy tonight's presentation and find it engaging and informative. So first up, we will have Alex Wolf. He is a conservation scientist at Scenic Hudson, and he's going to talk to you tonight about the How to Solar Now Toolkit developed by Scenic Hudson. So thank you, Alex.
Okay, thank you, Jen, for having me and for that introduction. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, great. Go ahead and start sharing my screen here. Okay, and hopefully everybody's seeing my mission slide up there. For those of you who may not know, Scenic Hudson is a not-for-profit organization. We are both an environmental advocacy group and a land trust that serves the entire Hudson Valley from just north of New York City up past Albany. And our mission is to preserve land and farms and create parks that connect people with the inspirational power of the Hudson while fighting threats to the river and the natural resources that are the foundation of the valley's prosperity. And the picture you see here is of Storm King Mountain in the Hudson Highlands. And this is perhaps one of the most picturesque peaks along the Hudson River. And Scenic Hudson got its start back in the 60s. There was a proposal to basically chop off the top of Storm King Mountain and put a hydroelectric power generation facility at the top of it. And so we started opposing a renewable energy project many decades ago. And we've come around since then to now supporting some renewable energy projects. And particularly we're interested in supporting responsibly sited solar. through our How to Solar Now toolkit and initiative. And a lot of people may not immediately understand what the connection is between our mission statement that you see here and the work that we've been doing for the past several decades, and now our sort of rampant boosterism of solar. And the reason for this is climate change. I think we're all seeing the changes in weather patterns that we're having, whether it's increasingly hazy skies here in New York from wildfires out west, or whether it's increased flooding, drought incidences. We're definitely seeing the changes. And from the perspective of a conservation organization like Scenic Hudson, we see these changes negatively impacting the things that we are trying to protect, whether it's habitat and species or working lands. So this cute little critter here is a rodent from Australia called the bramble case malomus, and it has the unfortunate distinction of being the first mammal that has gone extinct due to climate change. It lived on an island, and due to sea level rise, it is no longer with us. And we don't want to see this happening in New York. We don't want to see this happening to our biodiversity or to our natural spaces, but it is happening due to climate change. Similarly, Scenic Hudson works a lot to protect working farms in the Hudson Valley, and we're seeing farmers, their livelihoods are being impacted by climate change as well. Things like droughts, things like less predictable times for planting and seeding. We've lost several apple crops in the last few years to late frosts, and these are all consequences of a changing climate. So we really view climate change as a threat that is existential for Scenic Hudson's mission and for all of us living here in New York. On the upside, the state also seems to recognize that climate change is an existential threat and has been taking steps to promote renewable energy to combat climate change. So it started several years ago with an initiative to have 50% renewable energy by 2030. And we've been upping those numbers since then as scientists have increasingly realized just how dire things are getting. So we really need to move quickly to try to reach these renewable energy targets that the state is setting out and is supporting through policy and funding. And we, Scenic Hudson believes that these targets are the right way to go to protect, the things that we care about most and the things that make New York a great place to live. We hope that the Hudson Valley and New York State are going to be a model for the country for how to execute a swift and a just and fair transition to renewable energy. And it's vital that we do this while we conserve the ecological, agricultural, and cultural resources that make New York such a great place to live. I think a lot of what I'm going to talk about tonight, of course, we come at this from the perspective of the Hudson Valley, but I think most of it applies throughout New York State. One slight difference for the Hudson Valley, as opposed to some other areas of the state, is that we are primarily facing solar development and not wind. Other areas are seeing both solar and wind development or just wind development. But because the Hudson Valley deals primarily in solar, when you're talking about renewable energies, we are focusing on that with our advocacy efforts. And so the question is, how do we get there? We have these renewable energy targets that the state has set and that we believe in, but how do we execute this transition to renewable energy without negatively impacting all of the resources that I mentioned, the things that make us want to live here in New York? So the How to Solar Now toolkit is our answer to the question of how do we get there. It is a decision-making support toolkit for stakeholders here in the Hudson Valley, but throughout New York State as well, and trying to get everybody together in dealing with the climate crisis. And so we have 3 tools in the toolkit so far. The first we developed in 2018, which is a guide to citing renewable energy. And this document, which is a beautiful report, you can download it. And this really deals with individual projects. So things like screening, viewshed impacts, setbacks, things like that. What should you be thinking about? What are the best practices when you're thinking about a renewable energy development? The next tool we have is best practices and recommendations for zoning. And again, this says Hudson Valley, but it could just as easily say New York State. We have in common with you all in Cazenovia, the comprehensive planning process, zoning, home rule, things like that. So these resources, I think, are certainly applicable throughout New York State. But whereas the first item was site specific for individual projects, the solar zoning is obviously for municipalities as a whole, to think about how to revise your zoning to reflect sort of these changes in renewable energy. And then the last tool in the toolkit thus far is our solar mapping tool. This was developed with financial support from the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. And that's what I'm going to focus the rest of my time on here this evening. So again, this is a solar mapping tool. It's an online interactive mapping tool. We really wanted this to be an educational resource to help users to guide exploration and prioritization and to really inform the conversations. We engaged with several different groups of stakeholders when we started developing this, and it was farmers and agricultural experts, it was conservation scientists, it was municipal folks, people on planning and zoning boards, county officials, and it was also solar developers. And even from the solar developers, we were hearing that they would love more educational tools so that people understand projects that are being proposed, know the right questions to ask about them, that sort of a thing. So with that in mind, we're hoping that the solar mapping tool helps support comprehensive planning and zoning at the municipal level, that it helps users to assess a site for potential solar development. And ideally, folks will also use it to set community renewable energy goals and develop climate action plans. So the tool has lots of information in it that it's divided into 4 main parts. The first 3 are educational, and then the last is where the user gets to take the reins and really control everything that they're seeing and exploring. So part 1 is really background on solar and the types of solar you're going to see in New York State. And it sounds like you all have covered this back in the June session to some degree. But throughout the 4 parts of the tool, users basically have an overview on the left-hand side. They can scroll down and read. And then on the right side, they're going to have either interactive maps or more detailed information. So for instance, they can click here and learn more details about solar energy systems. We also tried to provide folks with some interactive things about, say, the size of projects. And again, you may have covered this in the June session, but I found when I started learning about solar that thinking about projects that are stated in kilowatts and megawatts, it's not always apparent what that's going to look like on the ground. So we have several common size groups here, and folks can click on these to see, for instance, this is an actual 2 megawatt project in Saugerties, New York, with the Catskills in the background there. So you can really get a sense of, if I say 25 kilowatts or 25 megawatts, what does that look like on the ground? Part 2 of the tool is called Smart Solar Planning, and my colleague Audrey Friedrichsen, who's a land use planning expert, she developed the 4 steps for smart solar planning. We found that a lot of developers come at this from sort of a technological and an economic standpoint of, what does the infrastructure look like on the ground? Where can I get a project done economically? And we wanted to take that and flip it on its head a little bit and start coming at this from a land use planning perspective. If you look at your municipality or your area as a whole, what are the existing patterns of land use, and which areas of your community does it make sense to start thinking about solar opportunities? So once you have that sort of overview, the comprehensive planning perspective, then you can start looking for the solar opportunities in step 2. And these are the places where you might build a solar project without any changes to land use. You can identify locations where there might be some impacts, but you can avoid the most negative impacts to the things that your community values the most. And then finally, you can start looking at evaluating the actual feasibility of a project from an engineering standpoint, from an economic standpoint. And part of the reason for doing that last, in addition to the advantages of thinking about it holistically as a community, is that the grid can always be upgraded. Economic incentives from the state have been changing over time, market forces change. And so, the feasibility aspect of things can change. But if you've done comprehensive planning, if you've set up your zoning so that you're steering projects to where it makes the most sense for your community, then those pieces are in place, and then the developers can worry more about the feasibility part. Now, in the solar mapping tool, we encourage folks to bring lots of local knowledge and local planning documents to the table. You all are fortunate in that Cassie and CPF have done a lot of this work for you, and so I'm going to leave that to her for her part of the talk. Part 3 of the solar mapping tool is called Learn About the Layers. We have lots of different data layers or informational layers that users can overlay in maps. And for each of these, we explain both what the layer is and how it relates to solar development. And we use those 4 steps of smart solar planning as a framework for going through all these different layers. So for instance, step 1, we talk about existing land use patterns. If folks don't know how to read the maps here, we have sort of help features that are interactive so they can learn how to read these maps, and they can zoom in and out on the right side here with their map. They can find their town, they can kind of explore. And as we go through the parts, different layers show up, but the map stays zoomed to your town, at least in the Hudson Valley. Not all these data layers do show up for Cazenovia, but again, you all have CPF and Cassie helping you out with that. So we have these solar opportunity layers. These are a few different layers where you could ostensibly put solar without impacting the current land use, or places like landfills, brownfield sites, et cetera, that are already contaminated and would be great places for solar. And again, we have interactive map on the right, and then an explanation of what you're seeing on that map on the left. Step 3, we go through the valued resources and where those are in your town or your community, and what are valued resources. It's what your community values most, but it's things like habitat, wetlands, agricultural soils, cultural and recreational sites, whatever those may be. We've done our best to map them here. And again, we're showing here, this is agricultural soils, prime farmlands, et cetera, explaining, what you're seeing on the map, but also how that relates to solar development. So even if your town isn't on the map here, there's some great information on the left-hand side. And we do include, again, sort of detailed dives or info dives, as we call them, with these blue buttons. So if you want to learn more about co-locating solar and agriculture, you can. And that's something that we spent some time gathering information and resources on. A lot of folks are very nervous about agricultural spaces losing out to solar. And we've found that, it doesn't have to be an either or, it can be an and there are opportunities to put solar on existing farms that are going to continue to be farmed. There are lots of great sort of co-benefits that can occur. And so we get into those in the solar mapping tool. So finally, we get into the development feasibility. And again, Cassie has looked at this for you all, so I'm going to skim over it, but we explain again sort of what the different grid elements are, what to think about when you're siting solar, and we have some informational resources here on the left side, as well as the interactive maps. So once users have sort of learned about solar, about smart planning for solar, and about all the layers at their disposal, then we sort of let them loose. They have full functionality in part 4. They can turn on and off any layers they want. They have other tools available to them, and they're really free to explore. I'm sorry to say that not all of our layers do extend outside the Hudson Valley, but some do. And again, Cassie is going to walk you all through a Cazenovia specific study that she's done with more detailed and more localized map layers, which is an incredible opportunity for you all. We did actually create a replication guide with the hope that the solar mapping tool might be replicated or used outside of the Hudson Valley throughout New York State. And sure enough, this is where Cassie and I started our conversation. And I think what helped her sort of get her project off the ground. So we're awfully glad that, folks outside of the Hudson Valley are seeing this as a resource and are using it. And again, I think much of the information in the solar mapping tool, as well as our other 2 resources, the siting guide and the zoning guide, those are all great resources throughout the state. So please feel free to check them out at howtosolarnow.org. And I will put that URL and my email in the chat in case anybody wants to follow up with me with questions, in case we don't have time for them later. So that's just a taste, but I wanted to make sure Cassie had enough time to do her presentation. So I will stop sharing and let her take over.
Thank you so much, Alex, for giving us that intro to the toolkit that you've developed. And next up, we will have Cassie Ferrante presenting this evening. She's a recent Colgate University graduate and was also an Upstate Institute Summer Research Fellow this past summer, doing her internship with the Cazenovia Preservation Foundation. We were so glad to have her. She did a fabulous job. And I will turn it over to Cassie now to tell you a little bit more about the work that she's completed over the summer. Thank you.
Thanks, Jen, and thanks, Alex, for your presentation and for the toolkit, which formed the basis of my project. I will start screen sharing. If anyone can't hear me or can't see the slides, please let me know. All right. So hi again. So my name is Cassie Ferrante, and like Jen said, I'm the CPF intern that has been working on adapting this solar mapping toolkit for the Cazenovia area. And so to give everyone a brief overview of what I'll be covering today, I'll start by going over state and local renewable energy targets, which Alex touched on. Then this project's timeline, solar siting in Cazenovia, the GIS, which stands for Geographic Information System data layers that I use to create the maps for the toolkit, along with the suitability matrix, the main map product I created along with the supporting maps, and finally key takeaways and findings from the project. So as Alex mentioned, New York State's current energy target is the 70 by 30 goal, or to have 70% of electricity generated from renewable sources by 2030. On a local level, the village and town of Cazenovia have taken their own steps to increase production of renewable energy, as seen in the 2015 Climate Action Plan on your right. Note that at the time of writing, the current state framework was to have 50% renewable energy by 2030. The plan hasn't been updated in the context of New York's current energy goal, so these numbers may be outdated. For this project, our primary focus was on commercial solar, which is highlighted in red here. The other types of solar projects, such as residential, municipal, and solar installations on school buildings, have already been identified as potential sites for solar energy. So with this framework in mind, and with the overview Jen gave and how this project came to be, I wanted to provide more detail on my role in the project. So in the fall of 2020, CPF reached out to Colgate University's Upstate Institute program to request an intern. The Upstate Institute places Colgate students with local organizations for the summer to assist with the research project. In this case, to create a decision support tool for the town and for CPF to use in these discussions around solar. At the time, Scenic Hudson had released its solar siting guidelines, but not the toolkit. In June, when I was brought on, Scenic Hudson had released its awesome solar mapping toolkit, which became the model for this project. Our goal, however, was to create a series of static maps that the town could use to evaluate projects down to the parcel level. And starting in July, CPF began attending the Town of Cazenovia Solar Working Committee meetings to receive feedback on the toolkit. So what does siting for solar in Cazenovia look like? First, we looked at site suitability with regard to solar, focusing on slope and aspect. And just to quickly define those terms, slope refers to the rise or fall of the landscape, and generally flat-lying areas are the best for solar development. Aspect refers to the direction a site faces, with south-facing slopes generally being the most suitable for solar. Next, we looked at conservation value, considering Cazenovia's historic, agricultural, and natural resources as consistent with CPF's mission. And then community input was considered in refining the model, and opportunities for additional input exist, like the public solar committee meetings. All of these factors were used to refine the current version of the model in order to identify the areas that are most or least suited to solar development. The toolkit can now be used to support municipal officials in decisions related to both solar planning and incoming project evaluations. So in creating the series of maps for the toolkit, the data hunting one was a big part of it. But we used the publicly accessible data layers that Scenic Hudson had included for their project. However, we also incorporated data sets that were locally available at a higher resolution, such as the zoning districts and the tax parcels that are specific for Cazenovia. In considering solar feasibility, we did not incorporate transmission lines and three-phase lines into the model but kept them as a visual data layer in the supporting maps to be considered in the context of other site characteristics. Like Alex said, the infrastructure can be upgraded, which can increase the number of potential sites for solar. Another reason we didn't include them was the importance of these lines depends on the type of project. For example, transmission lines matter more for larger projects that generate more electricity. And since these terms can be confusing, and I certainly was confused the first time I heard these terms, I wanted to take the time to explain what these lines are and why they matter in the context of solar energy generation. So transmission lines, as seen on the left over here, and three-phase lines are seen on the right over here. And so these transmission lines carry the bulk movement of electrical energy over high voltage lines. And so these lines are for large-scale energy generation projects and are designed to move power over long distances. And the map image shown is from one of the supporting maps. And so the green and blue lines shown here are the two main transmission lines that run through Cazenovia. And so on the right, three-phase distribution lines look like what we're accustomed to seeing in residential areas or along a main road. These lines are designed for regional distribution of power. And the accompanying map image illustrates the distribution of three-phase lines in Cazenovia. The different lines represent the hosting capacity of each line, or the amount of electricity each line can carry. And so these lines must have spare hosting capacity in order to support a connection to a solar project. And as shown here, the blue lines represent three-phase lines with the most hosting capacity. So going back to these layers, for a main product, the composite map, which I'll show in a few slides, we only included slope and aspect in ranking sites for compatibility with solar development. And then the mines, rooftops, and parking lots are included in the supporting maps as these are potential targets for solar that have already been identified. So we also considered several different types of resources for their conservation value. For example, the National Register of Historic Places and the location of wetlands. We also considered the Nature Conservancy's Resilient and Connected Network, which highlights existing areas of high biodiversity and habitat corridors to support climate-driven species migration. So after gathering and identifying these data layers, we ranked them according to the following suitability scale in order to locate the areas most or least suited to solar development. Shown is an excerpt of that matrix with the ranking scale here on the left. So working with CPF, I developed a first draft of the matrix, which was then reviewed by the Town of Cazenovia Solar Committee. These revised rankings were then incorporated into the model to create the composite map. For example, as seen here, wetlands have received a 1 rating because they are not a suitable location to build solar panels as they provide crucial habitat for many species. So finally on the maps, using GIS software, these layers were then stacked to create a composite map shown on the right. And I included a larger version of legend so it could be more legible on the left. And so solar development is currently prohibited in the areas shown in gray because of current zoning codes, or it is currently deemed unsuitable in these areas because they received a value of 1 in the ranking. Therefore, these areas were grayed out and excluded from the subsequent analysis. So then the remaining areas, the ones that did not receive a 1 rating, were ranked on a bivariate scale, considering both conservation value and solar feasibility. And this legend is shown on the left over here. So using the suitability rankings from the matrix, these layers were then combined within their category to produce a conservation value layer, shown in blue, and a solar feasibility layer, shown in red. So viewed together, areas in the brightest red, which I've circled here, are those which have the highest solar feasibility and lowest conservation value. In other words, the most suitable. Areas in the darkest blue are those which have low solar feasibility and high conservation value, or in other words, the least suitable for solar development. And since that was kind of like a grainy picture, I want to provide a more in-depth example of what this looks like. So here's an excerpt from the composite map that shows a range of suitability. And so the most suitable locations for solar would be the areas with the brightest red here at the top center of the map image. And then the darker area in the middle is the least suited to solar development because it has a high conservation value of the resources present. The areas in white contain resources with low conservation value, but also low solar feasibility. And so these are less suitable as well. And then another quality of the composite map that you can see here is the ability to assess the suitability of an area within an individual parcel, which are these dark gray lines on the back. So along with the composite map, I created a series of supporting maps. These were made to show the layers that holistically created the composite map. So on the left, I've included a description of what these are, and they include solar suitability, land cover, water, historic, natural, and agricultural resources, as well as scenic view sheds. So viewing these, you can see which resources have been grayed out on the composite map, which resources are in proximity to one another, and other useful information to assist with interpretations of the composite map. So for example, on the agricultural resources map here, I know it's a little hard to see, but the dark brown areas represent areas of prime farmland soil. So these are soils of the highest quality for growing crops. And then to give another example, on the scenic resources map over here, the dark orange colors represent areas with the highest scenic value. So in wrapping up this presentation tonight, I wanted to go over the main advantages of the toolkit, key takeaways from the composite map, and what's next for this project. So first, the greatest advantage of this product is that it provides a context for comprehensive planning strategies around solar development. This toolkit can be used to guide the course of solar in Cazenovia. And I'm also working on calculating the amount of area covered by the most suitable regions, which were those highlighted in red, to estimate the solar potential for Cazenovia. Another advantage of this toolkit is that it was created to be used at a local scale. Scenic Hudson's model was designed to be used at a more regional scale and primarily for areas in the Hudson Valley, whereas this one was designed specifically for Cazenovia. And so the key takeaways from the composite map are that there are dispersed pockets of suitable areas for solar, but not one large contiguous area. And that has implications for the direction of solar in Cazenovia. Another takeaway is that this project is an evaluation tool and it does not take the place of site-specific review. This tool is meant to provide more insight into project proposals brought before the town and village of Cazenovia. This also requires the addition of the solar developer's perspective on what is physically feasible for a project. And so finally, our goal is to continue to solicit community input through outreach events like tonight. The composite map can be updated based on revised suitability rankings, which in turn affect which locations are deemed suitable. Another future goal of the project is to develop an online interactive version like Scenic Hudson's, where you can view the different layers all at once. And this especially will allow the viewing board to understand the underlying basis for rankings like all in one time. And with that, I want to say thank you everyone for your attendance this evening, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Cassie. So at this point in the evening, we would like to open it up to some questions from the audience. We'd like to remind everyone that this evening's session is about understanding some of the tools that are available to help municipalities, community residents, land management organizations like CPF think about appropriate solar siting in our community, and not necessarily about specific sites or projects per se. If you have a question for one of the presenters, we'd ask that you use the hand raise feature in Zoom and we can call on you, or you can enter any questions that you might have in the chat. Is there anything that that you would like us to elaborate on a little bit more? Oh, I see a question from Jeff Navius. Would you like to unmute?
How does this interweave with the current zoning and process, both in the village and the town? And how does this relate to our surrounding communities, New Woodstock, Nelson, Fenner?
So 2 questions there.
Yes.
So I can speak to this a little bit, and I see that we have a member of our planning board here on the line tonight, who also has been part of that Town of Cazenovia Solar Working Committee group that's been meeting every other week to look at the revised code and consider how to incorporate some of the results of the model into that. So Cassie and I and others at CPF, we've had a chance to review the back end of this model with the Town of Cazenovia. And as that code is being updated, it sounds like the current plan is to use this model as a reference tool that would be called out as a resource in the revised code, similar to other like the Lake Watershed Protection Plan is currently referred to as a resource, a guiding resource in the code. And I will give Bob Ridler a chance. If you would like to, would you like to speak to that at all?
Sure. First, I'd like to thank all the presenters for an outstanding job. I know Cassie's done an extremely wonderful job of creating the overlay map. And Alex, your explanation tonight was very helpful for everyone, I believe. And as Jen indicated, I'm a member of the the town solar planning committee. And we're working to kind of gather as much information as we can regarding solar development within the town. And we're supported by CPF and those folks. So we're making headway in creating a kind of a town law, I guess, or codes for solar arrays within the town, and we hope to have that completed for public inspection, I guess, within the next several months. As you know, we've instituted a moratorium on solar development while we review all the information that we have and while we create our zoning ordinances and laws. We're always looking for input from the community as we work toward the conclusion of our project. I see there's several members on the Zoom tonight who attend our meetings, which are every other Tuesday. And so our next meeting is next Tuesday. I think that is October 5th. And so everyone's invited to, who's interested, to come to the town offices and participate in the development of our plan. So, and thank you to CPF for doing a great job in the leadership of creating these maps. And so I think, are there any other questions by anyone regarding this solar committee work that we're doing? I guess not. All right, Jen.
Thank you so much, Bob. And if anyone has anything else for Bob, you're welcome to pop that in the chat and we'll circle back. Thank you. Your second question, Jeffrey, I'll rephrase that. It's been a few moments here, so if I'm misspeaking, give me your question again. You're asking about the outlying areas, not so much right in the immediate Town of Cazenovia boundaries, but you mentioned New Woodstock, and that's certainly within the service area that we are considering for this mapping tool. And the project really started as a tool to support the Town of Cazenovia's process, as we started seeing some of these projects proposals coming before those Town of Cazenovia review boards, and as the town considered what its next steps would be with regard to updating its code pertaining to solar, commercial solar projects. Cassie could probably speak to this as well. We did discuss, as she was in the early planning stages of her project, we did make a deliberate decision to include the surrounding areas in the analysis as well. And certainly the areas not within the Town of Cazenovia that have some areas of their municipal service areas that overlap with the map, certainly we'd be happy to correspond with those municipal boards as well. Going back to the chat here, I see a couple of questions. One question came in: is the map that has been created available to the public at this point? And we have not made that product publicly available at this point. We would like to get final confirmation from the Town of Cazenovia that as they are working through some of the questions with regard to some updates or more specific information to be included in the town's code pertaining to commercial solar, we want to make sure that the model incorporates all of those changes. I see a question here. This is a question from Jeff Navius. How are the town and the village of Cazenovia working together? I might throw that one back to Bob Ridler.
Well, right now, since it appears that the greatest opportunity for solar development is in the town as opposed to the village, simply because there's obviously more open space within the town than the village. But we certainly are cooperating with the village and considering some sources or opportunities for solar developments within the village. And as we kind of move forward with our plan and so forth, we are sharing that, and we'll share it with the village government as we develop that plan, so that we're inclusive with both the town and the village.
Thank you, Bob. I see a question here from Lori Dudley, and this one's for Alex. Could you, Alex, speak to the type of vegetative screening or the type of vegetation screening and joint agricultural use co-locating with solar that have been used successfully and have good community support?
Sure, I can do my best at least. I'm by no means an expert on solar per se, but yeah, so there are a lot of, as Lori said, joint agricultural uses with solar. It's sometimes called co-location of agriculture and solar, or agrovoltaics. And there's a lot of experimentation being done with this, both in the US and in Europe, with sort of similar agricultural conditions. So some of the most cutting edge technology that I've seen being tested right now that I find particularly exciting is sort of translucent solar panels that allow sunlight to get to crops below. The University of Massachusetts also has some experimental solar arrays that they are growing produce underneath, so things like kale. And in a lot of these studies that are being done on this type of thing, they're finding that some crops actually do better underneath solar panels because they are less heat stressed and they're able to retain a little bit more moisture, getting shade for part of the day, but not all of the day. And simultaneously, the solar panels often run more efficiently because the evaporative cooling that happens from the plants helps to cool the solar panels. And heating is actually something that makes solar less efficient in a lot of cases. So there are some real sort of win-win scenarios with literally putting panels on top of some crops. And of course, some crops are amenable to this and some are not. You can also think about co-location at the level of a farm. So for instance, we know of at least one farmer here in the Hudson Valley who is sort of struggling financially. And, they said, look, I can either lease a third of my farm to solar, and I'm going to lease the least productive lands on my farm to a solar company. And I can keep farming the other 2/3 of my farm if I do that. Or if I don't do that, I'm basically not going to make it financially, and I'm going to be looking to sell to a housing developer. So there are also opportunities there where, you could see part of a farm, perhaps soils that have been already sort of over-farmed out of nutrients, or perhaps rocky soils, slopes that are a bit steeper, or places that don't drain very well. I know a lot of farmers around here have problems in a wet year where they just can't get in to work the fields because they're too wet, too late in the season. So those are all great places to put solar, and these solar panels can generate a really consistent income for farmers and offset some of the financial unpredictability that comes with farming. And you can envision fields where either they are too wet, there have been runoff and erosion issues in the past, or fields where they've been farmed with row crops too much and the nutrients are denuded. Putting solar on those fields and underplanting them with cover crops is going to help restore nutrients to the soil. It's going to help with runoff and erosion issues, things like that. So there are opportunities there as well. The last thing I'll mention another thing I'll mention is grazing. There is a New York Solar Grazing Association, and their goal is basically to connect people that farm sheep shepherds with solar companies. And this can be a win-win. Some solar companies are paying landscapers to come in and spray pesticides and mow and weed whack under their solar panels. And the Grazing Association seeks to basically find sheep to do that job for them. It's much lighter on the land. It provides shepherds with more leased lands to graze their sheep on. And so there's another sort of win-win scenario that can be found with agriculture and solar. Pollinator habitat is another one that solar developers like to bring up a lot, and there is certainly opportunity there. Ideally, it's not just a lawn underneath solar panels, but it's valuable vegetation, whether it's restoring nutrients or providing habitat for bees, butterflies, and other pollinators. And here in the Hudson Valley, pollinators are extremely important for our orchards. We have a lot of apple and other orchards around here, vineyards as well. And so for crops that need pollinators, you can again envision on a farm, a farmer may put part of their land in solar underplanted with pollinator plants, and those pollinators are going to serve their fields and pollinate their crops. So there are lots of win-win scenarios for co-locating agriculture and solar together. I won't go too far into screening because that can be quite site specific. Our renewable siting guide does have some general best practices and recommendations there. A lot of it depends on the lay of the land, but there certainly are effective ways to screen solar where it needs to be screened. I also think that some of the sort of apprehension around view sheds and solar is simply because it's quite new. Personally, every time I see a field of solar panels, it warms my heart because I know that it's a clean and renewable source of energy that we're using, and that we're offsetting fossil fuels by doing so, and helping to slow climate change. And I think a lot of it is just the novelty of it, and that once people get used to seeing them, it may not appear so striking to the eye. And I think a lot about those phase 3 distribution lines that I think a lot of people don't even see anymore. I often go to take a picture with a camera, And when I look at the picture, I notice the power lines that are blocking the view, but I haven't noticed them with my naked eye, and I don't see them day to day driving around, even though they run along every road just about in New York. So I think, there are ways to screen. Developers can use the lay of the land slope to sort of place solar panels where they're not going to be visible, for instance, from a scenic overlook where there might really be a public benefit to thinking about view shed. But there are also, I think, other, sort of other things that are just going to take a little bit of time getting used to.
And I might just follow up on that, Lori. I think I've seen, we should watch for what's coming out of Cornell Cooperative Extension, because I believe they have some work ongoing right now looking at options for agrivoltaics in the central New York area and what that could look like. And I know that the Town of Cazenovia Solar Committee is thinking about that as well, with the idea that under certain circumstances, for example, co-locating with grazing, the updated code might have some different height allowances for the overall height of a panel. That's something that's being considered. I think we've addressed everything that's in the chat at this point. Any other questions from members of the audience tonight? Any last questions or comments, or any last comments from either of you, Cassie or Alex?
I'll just thank everybody for attending tonight, and thank you to CPF for inviting me.
Well, thank you very much, Alex and Cassie, for your presentation this evening. Very well done. I'd like to give you a little bit of a sense for what's next, what's upcoming with regard to thinking about solar. Oh, I have one more new message. Maybe we have one last question. Okay.
Jen, I can speak to this last question if you want.
I see one more question has just come in. Well, I think we've got time. Lori asked if there were opportunities for parking lot solar or solar on commercial buildings. So Cassie, if you'd like to speak to that.
Yeah, so in the supporting maps, one of them is called Solar Suitability. And for the solar mapping toolkit, Scenic Hudson had pulled this, it's called the building like footprints, and it has 10,000 square foot, the 10,000 square foot building rooftops. And so basically it highlights, if you're going to place commercial solar, here's the places to start with first. And so on that supporting map, I've highlighted, rooftop spaces like as potential opportunities for solar. And then also usually if it's a larger building, it has a larger parking lot. And so that would be great for covered, to have like covered parking for cars, which also have solar panels on them, and also potentially to support electrical vehicles in the future. But yeah, both of those are, as Scenic Hudson recommended, already developed areas like large building rooftops and parking lots are a really big priority in looking for opportunities for solar.
Great, thank you so much. Well, we are getting close to our 8 o'clock timeline here, so I think we will wrap it up for this evening. If you do have more questions about the topic, please feel free to reach out to CPF. We would love to hear more from members of the community. There are 2 more sessions planned in this Beyond Rooftop Solar series. We had been looking at a date in mid-October for an industry and economics themed session. We have postponed that for a slightly later date due to some scheduling with potential speakers and other events on our community calendar. But look for updated information on the timing for that October session. And then we're looking at a session on November the 10th that really focuses in on considerations regarding farmland conversion to renewable energy generation. We'll be posting information about the format of those events, whether those will be online or in person, and final information on that October date for you soon. In the meantime, as I mentioned, if you missed the first session in the series, visit us at www.caspreservation.org. And on the Beyond Rooftop Solar webpage, you'll see the excerpts from session 1. In closing, we would like to thank our co-hosting organizations, Cazenovia Area Community Development Association, United Climate Action Network, and the Cazenovia Chamber of Commerce. We'd especially like to thank our presenters, Alex Wolf and Cassie Ferrante. And we'd like to thank all of you for being engaged on this topic and participating in the discussion. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you, Jen. Great job. All of you, did a great job presenting. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob.
Good night.
Great job.